The gun was already on the table between them when Joel Hunter heard the words that would either save him or condemn him. "She killed a man in Hargrove County," said the sheriff of Millbrook, a heavy-set man named Cord Dawes who smelled of tobacco and old grudges. "Burned down a gambling house in Redstone. And in Calico Flats, they say she ran 3 men off their own land using nothing but a lawyer's letter and a loaded Derringer." He leaned across the scarred oak table and dropped his voice to something between a warning and a dare. "Delia Bancroft is trouble in 3 counties, Hunter. You'd be a fool to let her anywhere near your spread." Joel looked at the gun on the table. It wasn't his. It belonged to the man who had just been dragged out of the Millbrook saloon by 2 deputies, a man who had put that weapon against the back of a woman's head and called her a thief. Joel had broken the man's wrist to get the gun away, and now here he sat, across from the sheriff, being told who the real problem was. He turned his head slowly toward the window. Through the dusty glass, he could see her standing on the boardwalk in the red afternoon light. Delia Bancroft. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, falling in thick waves around her jaw. Her dress was travel-worn and her boots were cracked at the heel, but she held herself like a woman who had never once in her life allowed herself to be small. She was watching him through the window. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone waiting to see if he was going to be a disappointment. "What was she supposed to have stolen?" Joel asked. Cord Dawes blinked. "That's not really the what was she supposed to have stolen, Cord," the sheriff exhaled. "Her own money. Kept in the safe of a man named Fenwick, who claims it was payment for a debt she owed." "And who decided it was a debt?" Silence. Joel pushed back his chair and stood up. He was 6'1" with weathered hands and steady eyes the color of winter sage. He picked up his hat from the table and settled it on his head and looked at the sheriff in the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved in his mind. "I've got a spare chair at my table out at the Hunter Ranch," he said. "If Miss Bancroft needs somewhere to land while she sorts out whatever it is she's sorting out, she's welcome to it." Cord Dawes stared at him. "I just told you she is trouble in 3 counties." Joel opened the door. The afternoon heat rolled in off the street like something alive. "Sounds like she's been giving trouble to the right people," he said. "I've got room for that kind." He had no way of knowing, standing in that doorway with the sun in his face and the sound of the sheriff sputtering behind him, that he was walking toward the most significant moment of his life. He had no way of knowing that Delia Bancroft carried a secret so dark and so carefully hidden that it would test everything he was. He did not know that forces already in motion in 3 separate counties were converging on this one small town, and that by the time they arrived, both of them would be forced to choose between survival and honesty, between self-protection and something much more dangerous. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew she was standing on that boardwalk in the dying light, and that something in him had already shifted, like a door opening inward that had been sealed shut for years. He walked toward her. She watched him come. And that was how it began. 6 weeks earlier, Delia Bancroft had arrived in the territory of New Mexico with $43 in a money belt, a forged letter of character, and a plan she had built from desperation and necessary lies. It was the spring of 1884, and she was 26 years old, and she had been running for so long that the running had started to feel like her natural state. The way breathing was natural. The way fear was natural. She had not been born into the kind of life that produced criminals. Her father had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, a quiet and serious man who believed in the law with the devotion of someone who had never seen it fail. Her mother had died when Delia was 11, and afterward it had been the 2 of them, her father and her, in a yellow house on a dirt road outside of Jefferson City. She had learned to read Latin before she learned to cook, which her father said was the correct order of priorities. He died when she was 19. A bad winter, a bad chest, and gone. The $43 was what remained of a life that had been sold off piece by piece to pay her father's debts. She had tried to hold the yellow house, tried to find work in Jefferson City, tried everything that a woman with a good education and no connections could try in 1879. None of it had been enough. She had taken a position as a housekeeper for a man named Gerald Fenwick in Hargrove County, and that was where everything had gone wrong, and that was the story she did not tell anyone if she could help it. Fenwick had been a land speculator and a swindler, though he wore good suits and used long words that made him sound like a man of consequence. He was in his mid-40s with soft hands and hard eyes, and he had hired Delia because she was educated enough to manage his correspondence and desperate enough to accept a salary that was barely adequate. Within 6 months, he had begun to manipulate that desperation in ways that were subtle at first and then increasingly explicit. He had started stealing from her. Slowly, incrementally, the way a man like Fenwick did everything. He had set up a system of fictional debts, small charges for room and board that he had never disclosed up front. Fees for the use of supplies he claimed were not included in her arrangement with him, and then a larger sum that he said she owed him for having vouched for her character to a previous employer she had never actually worked for. The debt was manufactured entirely from paper, and the specific kind of confidence a man has when he knows the law will side with him over a woman alone. When she confronted him, he had smiled. He had the kind of smile that knew exactly what it was doing. She had taken her money back. All of it, every dollar she had earned and every dollar he had stolen from her. She had found it in his safe one night when he was at a political dinner and she was alone in the house, and she had taken it and she had left and she had not gone back. He had called it theft. He had filed a claim with the county sheriff, and because he was Gerald Fenwick and she was a woman with no family and no standing, the sheriff had believed him. That was how the trouble in Hargrove County started. The gambling house in Redstone was different. That had been a genuine act of defiance rather than self-preservation, and she was not entirely sorry for it. She had been in Redstone working as a card dealer in an establishment owned by a man named Horace Beale, and she had discovered that Beale was running a game against the ranch hands of the valley, rigging his tables, and then using the debt to effectively indenture the men who lost everything. She had tried to report it and been laughed at. She had tried to confront Beale and been threatened. And so one Tuesday evening she had placed a lit oil lamp in the pile of rigged equipment he kept in the storage room off the back, and she had made sure everyone was out of the building first, and she had walked away while the flames took care of the evidence. Beale had rebuilt, but the game was gone and 3 ranch hands had been freed from their arrangements. It was the kind of trouble she could justify to herself in the dark when the weight of her own choices pressed down on her chest. Calico Flats was the most complicated. There was a widow there named Rosa Medina, who was being pushed off a parcel of land her late husband had worked for 20 years by a land company that was using fraudulent surveying documents to establish a boundary dispute. Delia had spent 2 weeks in the county clerk's office reading the original grants and comparing them to the documents the land company had filed, and she had written a letter to a lawyer in Santa Fe that was detailed enough and accurate enough that the lawyer had taken the case on contingency. The land company had sent men to persuade her to stop. She had kept the derringer her father left her loaded and in her skirt pocket, and the men had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. The land company had told everyone in 3 counties that she was a troublemaker and a thief and a woman of dangerous character. The story had preceded her everywhere she went. So by the time she walked into Millbrook, New Mexico in the spring of 1884, her reputation was fully formed. Her money was down to $43, and the forged letter of character was the last card she had to play. She had written it herself, signing it with the name of a pastor in Albuquerque she had never met, attesting to her honesty and industriousness and general moral fitness. It was a necessary fiction, and she hated herself only a moderate amount for it, which she thought was probably the correct proportion of self-hatred for the circumstances. She had not expected the man from the gambling house. His name was Terrence Mull, and he was from Redstone, and he had been sent by Horace Beale to find her, and he had found her in the Millbrook saloon where she had gone to inquire about work. He had put a gun to her head in front of 20 people and called her an arsonist and a thief, and several things that were not true. And she had gone very still and very cold inside because she knew how quickly a crowd could turn when the word thief was applied to a woman. She had also known, with a certainty that surprised her, that this particular man with the gun to her head was a coward, and that cowards could be waited out. What she had not expected was Joel Hunter. She had seen him at a table in the back. He had been sitting alone with a glass of water and a piece of paper he was reading, his hat pushed back on his head, looking for all the world like a man who was only peripherally interested in the rest of the room. And then Mull had put the gun to her head, and Joel Hunter had moved. She had never seen a man move like that. Not fast in the showy, theatrical way of men who wanted to be seen moving. Fast in the efficient way of a man who had already calculated every variable and simply executed the outcome. He had Mull's wrist broken before anyone in the room fully understood what was happening, and the gun was on the table, and Mull was on the floor, and Joel Hunter was standing between her and the crowd with his arms loose at his sides as if this were the most ordinary Tuesday of his life. The sheriff had come. Joel had gone inside. Delia had stood on the boardwalk and waited, because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, and she watched through the window while the heavy-set sheriff talked at Joel Hunter for a solid 10 minutes, and Joel Hunter said very little, and then he came out through the door and looked at her. She had braced herself. She had been braced for everything a man in his position could say to her. She had a speech ready, a careful and composed explanation of her circumstances that disclosed as little as possible while establishing enough credibility to prevent immediate disaster. She had given variations of this speech many times and she was very good at it. He said, "I've got a spare chair at my table. You look like you need somewhere to sit." She had stared at him. "The sheriff tells me you're trouble in 3 counties, he added. "He's not wrong," she said, because she was too tired to lie and too surprised to calculate. "I've got room for that kind of trouble," Joel Hunter said. "My name is Joel Hunter. I have a cattle ranch about 7 miles south of here. The chair is a real one if you need it." She had looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the hidden motive. There was always a hidden motive. Men did not offer things to women like her without wanting something back. "What do you want in return?" she asked. He seemed to think about this seriously. "An honest answer to a question," he said. "Did you do the things they're saying you did?" She considered lying. She considered the speech she had prepared. She looked at his face, which was the face of a man who had been told things by the sheriff and had come out the door anyway. "Most of them," she said. "The version they're telling isn't accurate, but most of it happened." He nodded. "That's all I wanted," he said. "The honest answer. Come on, I'll get my horse." The Hunter Ranch was not what she expected. She had constructed it in her imagination during the 7-mile ride south, a hard and utilitarian place, minimally kept, the kind of property a lone man maintains to function rather than to live. She had been wrong. The house was adobe, solid and well-proportioned, with a long covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. There was a kitchen garden that showed signs of recent and careful tending. The barn was clean. The fences were maintained. It was the property of a man who genuinely cared about where he lived, and the realization landed strangely in her chest, because it was not a quality she had often encountered. He showed her to a room at the back of the house. It was small but well lit, with a window that caught the afternoon sun and a bed with a quilt that was faded but clean. There was a pitcher and basin and a small chest of drawers and a hook on the wall for clothes. "There's no one else here," he said. "My ranch hand Emmett lives in the bunkhouse. He's a quiet sort and he minds his own business. You're safe here." She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the quilt and felt something in her throat that she refused to let become tears. "I'll earn my keep," she said. "I'm not charity." "I know you're not," he said, and left her to it. He did not press her for information that first night. He made supper, a straightforward meal of beans and salt pork and corn bread, and he set the table for two and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and he asked her what she took in her coffee, and whether she preferred to eat quietly or to talk. And when she said quietly, he nodded and they ate in a silence that was, astonishingly, not uncomfortable. She lay awake that night in the back room and stared at the ceiling, and tried to assess her situation with the clinical detachment she had cultivated over years of being in bad situations. She was in the house of a stranger. The stranger was a man. She had no money, no documentation of real value, and at least 3 separate parties who might eventually track her to this location. She was also, by any reasonable measure, more comfortable and more physically safe than she had been in months. The assessment should have been alarming. It was, instead, almost unbearably strange, because the dominant emotion she felt was not fear. It was something quieter and harder to name, something that had to do with the spare chair and the coffee question, and the silence at the supper table that had asked nothing of her. She told herself it was relief. She told herself it was simply exhaustion finding a temporary resting place. She told herself it was nothing. She did not entirely believe herself. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself at the Hunter Ranch that felt, to Delia, both fragile and solid at the same time, like ice in early spring that you tested with each step. She rose before Joel and made breakfast, because she had told him she would earn her keep, and she intended to keep her word even if every other commitment she had ever made to anyone had been complicated by circumstances. He thanked her every morning with a simplicity that never felt performative. It was the gratitude of a man who meant what he said. She learned the shape of his days. He was up and at the cattle before full light, working the range with Emmett until mid-morning. He came back to the house for water and to check on whatever needed checking, and he had a directness about his movements that she came to find deeply calming, because everything he did had a reason, and the reason was never to control or impress or manipulate. He worked because the work needed doing. He was there because the ranch required him. He was honest because lying required an effort he found pointless. She learned these things by watching, because she was a woman who had survived by watching, by reading the room before she walked into it, by understanding the architecture of a person's behavior before she allowed herself to trust any individual element of it. She also helped with the correspondence. He had a stack of papers on the desk in the front room, contracts and grazing agreements, and a running dispute with a neighboring rancher named Archibald Prine over a shared water source, and she offered to help him organize and respond to them. He handed the stack over without hesitation, and she saw immediately that he was a competent man but not a paperwork man, and that the dispute with Prine was actually something he could win if the correspondence were handled correctly. She wrote 3 letters for him. The first to Archibald Prine's lawyer, which was precise and legally grounded, and cited 2 territorial statutes she had memorized from the county clerk's office in Calico Flats. The second to the county recorder, requesting a copy of the original grant documentation for the Hunter property. The third to a water rights mediator in Santa Fe, initiating a formal process that would circumvent the local leverage Prine was trying to apply. Joel read all 3 letters sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon. He read slowly and thoroughly, and when he was done he looked up and said, "Where did you learn to write like this?" "My father was a school teacher," she said. "And I spent 2 weeks in a county clerk's office in Calico Flats reading land grants." He set the letters down. "You're the one who helped Rosa Medina," he said. "She went very still. You know her." "I know of her. The story came through here. A woman went up against the Western Land and Survey Company and won." He paused. "They said the woman disappeared before the case was settled." "She didn't need me after the lawyer took over," Delia said. "And staying in one place too long tends to cause problems." He looked at her steadily. "You left before you could be thanked. Gratitude doesn't buy passage out of a county where a land company is looking for you." He was quiet for a moment. "The man in Redstone, Beale, was anyone in the building when you set the fire?" She met his eyes. I checked 3 times, she said. I would not have done it if anyone was inside. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but deepened the way a landscape looks different when the light changes angle. I believe you, he said. Why? She asked, genuinely wanting to know, not challenging him, genuinely curious about the mechanism of his trust. Because you just told me something that could get you arrested, he said. And you didn't hedge it or dress it up. You just said it. He picked up the letters and tapped them on the table to align the edges. People don't volunteer honest things about themselves unless the honesty is a habit. She looked at him across the table and felt something shift in her own chest, not the small, cautious shift of someone reassessing a threat level. Something larger and more frightening, something that opened like a window in a room she had kept sealed. She looked away first. That evening she told him about Fenwick. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. She told him about the manufactured debt, and the stolen wages, and the night she had opened the safe, and taken what was hers. She told him in a flat and factual voice, sitting across from him at the supper table in the lamplight, and she watched his face while she talked. It was the most deliberate act of trust she could remember performing in years, and it was deliberate. She was doing it on purpose, because she had watched him for a week and she had decided he deserved honesty, even if honesty was the most dangerous thing she owned. When she was done, he said, "What do you want to do about Fenwick?" "I want it to be over," she said. "I want him to stop having any claim on me. I want to be able to stay somewhere longer than 3 months without looking over my shoulder." "There might be a way to do that legally," he said. "If we can document what he actually owed you and what he stole. The forged debt he constructed would be fraud. That's not nothing." She stared at him. "That would take months, and I'd need someone willing to testify." "Do you have records? Anything from when you worked for him?" She had records. She had carried them for 5 years the way other people carried wounds, in the bottom of her bag under everything else. Because some part of her had always believed that survival was only the first step, and that the second step was eventually being able to fight back. She had payroll stubs, a copy of the original agreement she had signed, and a letter from Fenwick's own hand in which he referenced the debt in a way that was internally inconsistent with any legitimate arrangement. "I have records," she said. Joel nodded. "Then we don't just hide," he said. "We build a case." "We," she repeated. "If you'll let me help." She looked at him across the lamplit table. She thought about hidden motives. She thought about every man who had offered help and meant something else. She thought about the broken wrist of Terrence Mull and the steady way Joel Hunter had stood between her and the crowd, not heroically, not dramatically, just practically and correctly, because it was the right thing to do. "Why?" she asked again. "Because what you're describing is wrong," he said simply. "And I have a lawyer in Santa Fe who owes me a favor." She laughed. It surprised both of them. It was not a polished laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has not laughed in a long time and has forgotten the sound of their own voice doing it. He smiled, and it transformed his face entirely. He was a serious man and the seriousness suited him, but the smile was something else. It was the smile of a man who was fully present in the moment he was in, not performing warmth but actually feeling it. She filed the laugh away in the part of herself where she kept things that frightened her. Emmett, the ranch hand, was a wiry and sun-darkened man of about 40 who communicated primarily in single syllables and directional nods. He had been working the Hunter Ranch for 6 years and had an air of complete loyalty combined with complete incuriosity about other people's business. He treated Delia's presence with the same equanimity he appeared to treat everything, acknowledging her at meals with a nod and occasionally leaving firewood stacked by the kitchen door without being asked, which she took as a form of acceptance. Within the second week, she had established herself sufficiently that she began to see the ranch as a working entity rather than a temporary refuge. And this was both comfortable and dangerous, because she had promised herself long ago that she did not get attached to places. Places could be taken. Places had been taken. She began riding out with Joel in the mornings. Not to work the cattle. She was competent on a horse but not practiced in ranching. But because the mornings were clear and the landscape south of Millbrook was a kind of beauty she had not been prepared for. The mountains held snow on their peaks well into spring, and the desert floor was alive with things she had no names for, small flowers of yellow and purple, the sudden theatrical appearance of a hawk, the way the light moved across the flat ground in a progression from pink to gold to the high white of full morning. She asked him the names of things. He knew most of them. He had grown up in this territory. His father had come out from Tennessee in the 1850s and had broken this land from raw desert with nothing but intention and stubbornness. And Joel had grown up knowing the names of every plant and bird and geological feature within 50 miles in the way that people who grow up in a place absorb its vocabulary without effort. She liked listening to him talk about it. He was not an effusive man. He did not elaborate beyond what was asked, but what he said was always precise and interesting, and she found herself asking more questions than she intended to, which was its own kind of warning that she mostly ignored. She asked him once about his own history, about what had happened to his father, about why he was running a ranch of this size alone. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. They were on horseback, moving along the edge of the southern pasture in the early morning light. "My father died in 1879, he said. His heart. My mother had gone back to Tennessee to care for her own mother, and she never came back out here. She sends letters." A pause. "I had a brother, Daniel. He went to work the mines in Colorado in 1881, and he was killed in a shaft collapse in 1882. She said nothing. She did not offer the empty sympathies that people offered because they needed to say something. She let the silence be what it was. "I meant to go find work elsewhere after Daniel died," he said, "but I couldn't quite leave the ranch. It felt like abandoning something." "I understand that," she said, "not wanting to leave a thing that someone else built and loved." He looked at her. "You said that like you know what it cost." "I sold my father's house," she said, "piece by piece, and then all at once, I still dream about the kitchen window." It was the most personal thing she had told him. She had not planned to say it, and she was not entirely sure why she did, except that the morning light was very clear, and he had just told her about Daniel and the shaft collapse and the mother in Tennessee who never came back, and it felt like a fair exchange. He looked at her for a moment longer than was casual, and then turned his eyes back to the mountains. "The kitchen window," he repeated, quietly, as if he was filing it away somewhere. She felt the warmth of being understood before she had even finished speaking, and it was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since Terrence Mull put the gun to her head, because at least that she knew how to handle. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, the lawyer arrived. His name was Martin Shee, and he was from Santa Fe, and he was the most impeccably turned-out man Delia had ever seen west of Jefferson City. He arrived on a Wednesday morning with a leather case and a waxed mustache and a manner that was precise and formal, and she discovered within 10 minutes, entirely honest. Joel had written to him 2 weeks before, explaining the outlines of the Fenwick situation without disclosing her location, and Martin Shee had driven up from Santa Fe because he was interested. "Gerald Fenwick," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with her records spread out before him, "is a name I know. He has been investigated twice by the Territorial Land Office. Both times the investigation came to nothing because the witnesses would not cooperate." He looked up at her over his spectacles. "Would you cooperate? What would cooperation require? A formal statement, documentation which you have, potentially testimony before a territorial judge if it comes to that. And what happens to me in the meantime? I'm currently the subject of an active theft claim. The claim is weak. It rests entirely on Fenwick's characterization of an informal debt arrangement, and his own letter here," he tapped the document she had carried for 5 years, "contradicts the terms he would need to prove. If we file first and file correctly, we reframe the entire situation. He becomes the defendant." She looked at Joel, who was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, listening and not speaking in the way he had of being fully present without imposing himself. "What do you think?" she asked him. "I think Martin is good at his job," Joel said, "and I think you've been running long enough." It was the simplest and most accurate sentence anyone had said to her in years. "All right," she said to Martin. "How do we start?" They spent 2 days going through every document she had, and Martin asked questions that were careful and precise and never strayed into the territory of the unnecessary. He was building something with her records, a structure of legal argument, and she could see the architecture of it forming, and she understood it. And at one point she made a suggestion about the framing of a particular claim, and he looked at her over his spectacles again. "You understand contract law," he said. "I understand enough," she said. "I had to survive the last 5 years." He nodded slowly. "I may need you to help me draft some of the language." Your understanding of the internal inconsistency in his documentation is more sophisticated than I initially credited. She felt something strange and proud move through her. Martin left on Thursday with the documents and a promise to file in the Santa Fe Territorial Court within the fortnight. The next step would depend on the court's response, but he was confident that the Fenwick claim against her could be challenged and likely overturned within 6 months. 6 months. It was a long time, and not as long as 5 years. That evening she and Joel sat on the porch in the cooling darkness. There was a moon coming up over the mountains, and the cattle were quiet in the near pasture, and the night was full of the small sounds of the desert doing what the desert does after the heat releases its hold. She said, "I need to tell you something." He turned his head toward her. "The letter I had when I came to Millbrook, the letter of character from the pastor in Albuquerque. I remember you mentioned it. I wrote it myself. The pastor doesn't know me. I forged his signature." She said it to the darkness, to the moon, because it was easier than saying it directly to him. "I want you to know that. Because everything else I've told you has been true, and I don't want that thing sitting there unacknowledged." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you write it?" "Because no one was going to believe anything about me without a reference, and I didn't have one that would stand up." She paused. "And because I am, as the sheriff of Millbrook correctly identified, trouble in 3 counties, I needed something to counteract that." Another silence. The moon cleared the mountain ridge and flooded the porch with pale silver light. "I'm not going to pretend that wasn't wrong," he said, "but I understand why you did it." He paused again. "Thank you for telling me. I didn't want you to find out from someone else later." "Why?" She turned and looked at him in the moonlight, and his face was serious and open, and she recognized, with a clarity that was almost physically uncomfortable, that she had told him because his opinion of her mattered, not as a calculating matter of strategic trust building. It mattered because he mattered, because somewhere in the last 3 weeks this man had become someone whose good opinion she wanted the way she wanted water, naturally and without the ability to fully explain it. She looked back at the mountains. "Because I'm trying to be honest," she said, "even when it's inconvenient." He said nothing for a long moment, and then, "Delia," she looked at him again. "I'm glad you're here," he said, "whatever the letter of character said." She did not respond to that because she could not without saying something that would make her feel dangerously exposed, and she had been exposed enough for one night. But she held the words in her chest for a long time after they went inside, and they were warm there, which was the most frightening thing about them. The trouble arrived in the 4th week. She had known it would. Trouble had a way of following her that was less like coincidence and more like obligation, as if the universe had decided that she was the kind of person things happened to and had committed to the premise. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback who appeared at the gate of the Hunter ranch on a hot Tuesday morning and asked to speak with a woman named Delia Bancroft. Joel was in the barn when they arrived. Delia saw them from the kitchen window. She recognized neither face, but she recognized the type. Men hired to find and retrieve, not to harm, not yet, but carrying the implicit threat of escalation if the retrieval became complicated. Fenwick's men, almost certainly, or possibly the Western Land and Survey Company, or possibly both, because her past had a way of compressing itself into simultaneous reckonings. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the porch. "I'm Delia Bancroft," she said. The taller of the two men had a sunburned face and a practiced neutrality of expression. "Ma'am, we're representatives of Mr. Gerald Fenwick of Hargrove County. Mr. Fenwick requests your return to address an outstanding legal matter." "I'm aware of Mr. Fenwick's claim," she said. "It is currently the subject of proceedings in the Santa Fe Territorial Court. Any further contact should be directed to my legal representative, Martin Shee of Santa Fe." The man's neutrality flickered briefly. He had not expected a legal representative. Men like Fenwick sent men like this specifically because they expected the women they were looking for to be without resources, and the existence of a lawyer in Santa Fe was the kind of resource that complicated the retrieval considerably. "We're not here about the court," the man said. "We're here about a separate matter." "Then Mr. Shee will still want to hear about it," she said. "Good morning." She went back inside. Joel was at the porch steps by the time she reached the door. He had come from the barn at a measured pace. He looked at the two men who were still at the gate conducting a quiet conference. "Fenwick's?" he asked. "Almost certainly," she said. "They mentioned a separate matter which worries me more than the obvious one." Joel looked at the men for another moment, then said, "Emmett." Emmett appeared from the side of the barn. "I see them," he said. "Keep an eye," Joel said. It was not a dramatic instruction. It was a practical one. The men left within the hour. They did not come back that day. But their presence had shifted something, because now the ranch was no longer simply a place where she had landed, but a place that was connected to her situation, a place that could be pulled into her trouble, and that thought settled in her chest with a weight she did not like. She found Joel at the fence that afternoon and she said, "This is going to get complicated." "It was already complicated," he said. "What changed?" They said a separate matter. Fenwick isn't just pursuing the theft claim. He's doing something else. What kind of something else? She thought carefully. Fenwick is a land speculator. He has been investigated twice by the Territorial Land Office and cleared both times. I was his housekeeper and his correspondence manager for 8 months. I know things about his business that I never told anyone because I was trying to survive, not to fight. She paused. "The documents I carried, the ones I gave Martin there about my wages, but I have a memory. I have a very good memory. And I remember things about his surveying contracts and his claims filings that would be extremely useful to the Territorial Land Office investigation if they were ever stated in a formal affidavit." Joel was watching her steadily. "He knows that. If he's pieced together who helped Rosa Medina, and I think he has, then yes, he knows I know enough to damage him seriously. So this isn't just about reclaiming his money. He's trying to get ahead of you." "Yes." Joel set down the fence tool he had been holding and looked at the horizon. She watched him think. It was one of the things she had noticed about him early, that he thought before he spoke, not out of calculation but out of genuine process, actually working the problem before he offered a solution. "Then we need to move faster than he does," Joel said. "Can you write down everything you remember? All the business details? Surveying contracts, claims, filings, whatever you know." "I can write it as a statement," she said. "It would need to go to the Territorial Land Office, not just to Martin." "Write it," he said. "Tonight if you can. I'll ride to Millbrook in the morning and send a telegram to Martin and to the Land Office both." She looked at him. She thought about the hidden motive again, reflexively, the way you checked a door latch you had already verified was locked. There was still nothing there, just a man solving a problem. "Joel," she said. He looked at her. "Why are you doing all of this? And I want the real answer, not the one about it being the right thing, the real one underneath that." He was quiet for a long moment. A hawk traced a lazy arc above the far pasture. The late afternoon light turned everything amber. "Because I haven't cared about what was happening in this house since my brother died," he said. "And I have started to care again. And I would like that to continue." He picked up the fence tool. "I'll be at the barn if you need anything." He walked away, and she stood there in the amber light and understood with complete and somewhat terrifying clarity that she was in love with Joel Hunter. She had not intended to be. She had very specifically not intended to be. She had a plan, which was to survive and to fight Fenwick legally and to eventually find a place where she could be still. And falling in love with the first decent man she encountered was not in the plan, and it was not, she told herself sternly, a good idea. It was also, apparently, non-negotiable. She wrote the statement that night. It took 4 hours and covered 11 pages of paper in her careful, schoolteacher's daughter handwriting, and it was meticulous and specific, and she knew it was probably the most legally dangerous thing she had ever done, because it put her in the position of a witness, and witnesses could be targeted, and she had spent 5 years being very careful about being targeted. But she also thought about Rosa Medina's land, and about the ranch hands in Redstone, and about all the people who had been less lucky than her, who had encountered Gerald Fenwick and his kind without the education to fight back and without a very good memory, and without someone like Joel Hunter offering them a spare chair. She wrote everything she remembered, every name, every date, every contract number she had copied or filed or witnessed. She wrote it in the flat and factual voice she used for legal documents, stripped of emotion, because emotion was not what the Territorial Land Office needed. What they needed was the kind of detail that could only come from someone who had been inside the operation and paid attention, and she had been both. When she was done, she read it through twice and made 2 corrections, and then she went to bed and slept better than she had in months. Joel rode to Millbrook the next morning before she was up. He was back by noon with a telegram receipt for Martin Shee and a separate receipt for the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and he said the sheriff of Millbrook had also been given a copy of the statement and had gone noticeably pale while reading it, which she took as a good sign. Over the following days, there was a period of waiting that had the specific tension of something about to break. She kept busy. She continued helping with the correspondence, and the water rights dispute with Archibald Prine was progressing well, because the letters she had written had correctly anticipated his legal position and established Joel's prior claim in terms that the mediator in Santa Fe found persuasive. She also started teaching herself the more practical elements of ranch management, talking to Emmett about the cattle rotation and the schedule of the pastures and the water management, because if she was going to be here and useful, she was going to be genuinely useful. Emmett, who said perhaps 12 words a day to anyone, said to her one afternoon as they were checking the fence on the north pasture, "You're staying." It was not a question. She looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded as if this were an entirely satisfactory answer. Then he said, "Good for him if you do." He went back to the fence, and she felt something warm move through her that she did not try to name. She and Joel began to talk in the evenings in a way that was different from the careful information exchange of the first weeks. They talked about things that had no utility, no purpose beyond the simple fact of 2 people being interested in each other's minds. He told her about the books he had read, which were more numerous and more varied than she had expected. There was a shelf in the front room that included law books, natural history, a worn Shakespeare, and 3 volumes of the Waverley novels, and she had questions about all of them. She told him about her father's library, and about the Latin she had learned and then never had occasion to use, and he laughed when she recited a passage she remembered from Virgil, not unkindly but with genuine delight. "I want to hear more of that," he said. "Latin." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because you remembered it," he said. "Because you kept it." He looked at her with the directness that she still found startling even after weeks. "You've kept a lot of things, Delia, under circumstances that would have made most people throw everything overboard just to stay above water." She did not know what to say to that. "I kept too much, maybe," she said finally. "The records, the letter from Fenwick's own hand. I was carrying all of it for 5 years. It's a lot of weight." "Or it's what saved you," he said. "And now it's what saves other people who can't save themselves." She looked at him across the firelit room, and the weight of what she felt for him pressed on her chest with the comfortable pressure of something true. "Joel," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you something, and I need you to not make it into more than I can handle right now." He waited. "I think I am starting to trust you," she said. "Actually trust you. And that terrifies me more than Fenwick and more than the sheriff in Millbrook and more than any of it, because trust has been the most expensive thing I own, and I have not been careful with it before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to use it against you. Those are the only promises I can make right now, because I think anything bigger would be more than you need tonight." She exhaled. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." It was the most perfectly calibrated thing anyone had ever said to her. She went to bed that night with the feeling of something settling into alignment that had been out of true for a long time. The letter from Martin Shee arrived in the second week of May. It was the most important document she had received in years, and she read it 3 times standing at the kitchen table with Joel beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm. The territorial court had accepted the filing. The Fenwick theft claim was suspended pending the hearing on the counterclaim. Additionally, the Territorial Land Office had received her statement and had opened a formal investigation into Gerald Fenwick's surveying contracts and land claims filings, based on her testimony and the corroborating inconsistencies that Martin had identified in the documents she had provided. Fenwick had been notified of both proceedings. Martin's final paragraph was precise and measured. "The likelihood of a successful resolution in your favor is, in my assessment, strong. I would estimate proceedings to be substantially resolved within 4 months. In the meantime, the legal risk to you is considerably reduced." She set the letter down. Joel said, "Breathing room." "Breathing room," she agreed. And then she turned to him, because he was right there and the letter was in her hands and the news was real, and she was more moved than she wanted to be. And she said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," he said. "I wrote 11 pages of legal testimony, and I have spent the last month fighting a battle I've been running from for 5 years, she said. "And none of that would have happened without you handing me Martin Shee and your porch and the spare chair." "You would have found your way to it eventually," he said. "You're that kind of person." "Maybe," she said, "but not here and not now." She looked at him. "Joel." "Yes." "I'm not starting something I cannot finish," she said carefully. "I need you to understand that. I'm not the kind of woman who lets herself feel things she isn't prepared to act on." He looked at her. His eyes were very steady and very warm and completely serious. "I understand," he said. "I'm not the kind of man who says things he doesn't mean." A pause. "So I'll say this carefully. I don't know exactly what this is yet. But I know that this is the first time since Daniel died that I have come home to this house and felt like it was inhabited, like it was alive." He paused again. "And I would like the chance to understand what that means if you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the reasons she had assembled over 5 years for why connection was a liability and vulnerability was a trap and attachment was the thing that made you slow. She looked at all of those reasons and she acknowledged that they were real and that they had served her, and that they had also kept her alone in a way that had cost her something she was only now beginning to name. "I'm willing," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the kitchen table. Not dramatically, just held it. His hand was rough and warm and large, and it covered hers with a solidity that was the physical equivalent of everything he was. She looked at their hands on the kitchen table in the morning light, and she did not pull away. June in the high desert was a different kind of beautiful than May. The mornings were hotter faster, the light coming in sharp and clear, and the mountains held their blue distance like a promise. She rode out with Joel every morning now, not because she was finding the landscape new, but because the mornings were when they talked most easily, on horseback with the ranch spread below them and the day just beginning. And talking with Joel was one of her consistent pleasures, which still surprised her each time she noticed it. He had begun, without fanfare or announcement, to make space for her in the decisions of the ranch. Not to defer to her, but to include her. He asked her opinion about the grazing rotation after she had spent a week talking to Emmett about it. He asked her what she thought about a potential deal with a cattle buyer from Albuquerque who had sent a letter. He showed her the accounts and explained how the ranch worked financially, because she had asked once and he had answered fully, and then had continued to include her as if it were the obvious and natural thing to do. She understood what he was doing. He was making room for her not just in the house, but in the life of the place. He was doing it slowly and practically, and without the emotional pressure of someone who needed a particular response. He was simply making room and leaving it to her to decide how much of it to take up. She took up more of it every week. The news from Martin Shee came regularly now. The Fenwick proceedings were moving with a speed that Martin found unusual and she found satisfying. The Territorial Land Office investigation had uncovered 3 additional cases of fraudulent filing that had nothing to do with her, and the weight of the accumulated evidence had shifted the proceedings from a dispute between Delia Bancroft and Gerald Fenwick into something much larger, a formal government investigation into the pattern of fraud that Fenwick had been conducting across 3 counties. In July, Martin wrote to say that Fenwick's lawyer had filed a motion to have all proceedings against Delia dismissed in exchange for her formal agreement to cooperate with the Land Office investigation as a witness. It was a capitulation dressed as a negotiation, and Martin's advice was to accept it on the condition that the dismissal was unconditional and permanent. She wrote back to accept. She read Martin's letter on the porch with the evening light going copper and gold across the pastures, and when she was done she sat very still and felt, for the first time in 5 years, like the ground beneath her had stopped moving. Joel came out to the porch and looked at her and said, "Good news." "The best kind," she said. "The kind that means it's over." He sat down beside her, close. She could feel the warmth of his arm against hers. "Gerald Fenwick?" he asked. "His lawyer is cutting him loose to save the business," she said. "All charges against me are dropped. In exchange, I cooperate with the Land Office investigation as a witness, which I was going to do anyway." She folded the letter. "In practical terms, it means I can go wherever I want to go without looking over my shoulder." She had meant the statement as information. She heard it land as something else entirely. "Is that what you want?" he asked, quietly. Not with the forced casualness of someone pretending not to care, with the directness of someone who is going to accept the answer whatever it is. She looked at the mountains. The sun was behind them now, and the sky above the peaks was the color of deep water. "What I want," she said, "is to stay here. I want to keep working on the water rights dispute and managing the correspondence and learning how the cattle rotation works. I want to keep making breakfast and listening to you tell me the names of things I don't know." She paused. "I want to keep sitting here on this porch in the evening. I want a lot of things that are located in this specific place." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him choosing his words, not because he was uncertain of them, but because he wanted to say them correctly. "Delia," he said, "I would like you to stay. Not as the woman in the back room who is managing the correspondence, as the person who is here because she wants to be and who I want to be here. I want that plainly and without conditions." She turned to look at him in the last of the light. His face was the face she had been learning for 2 months, the serious eyes and the line of his jaw and the mouth that was not quick to smile but meant the smile completely when it arrived. "I've been running for 5 years," she said. "I don't entirely know how to stop." "You stop by stopping," he said simply. "You stop by staying put and finding out that the ground holds." She reached over and took his hand, the way he had taken hers on the kitchen table in May, and she said, "Then I'm staying." He turned his hand over and held hers, and the evening settled around them, warm and still, and the cattle moved in the pasture below, and the mountains went dark against the sky, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. The water rights dispute with Archibald Prine was resolved in August, in Joel's favor. It was a practical victory that had real financial consequence for the ranch, and Martin Shee, who had managed the negotiation alongside the mediator, sent a letter of congratulations that was warmly specific about Delia's contribution to the outcome. He noted that her initial letters to Prine's lawyer and to the mediator had framed the issue so effectively that the subsequent mediation had essentially been a confirmation of positions already established on paper. Joel read Martin's letter aloud at the breakfast table and looked at her when he finished. "You saved me that water source," he said. "Your argument was already sound," she said. "I just put it in the right language." "Language matters," he said, "as much as anything else." She thought about that. Language did matter. She had learned that in the county clerk's office and in the letter she had written for Rosa Medina's lawyer and in the 11 pages of testimony she had written about Fenwick. Language was the tool that made it possible for the smaller and the less powerful to engage with the systems that otherwise simply ignored them. She had good language, and she had learned to use it as precisely as a scalpel. "What are you thinking?" Joel asked. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that there are probably other people in this territory who need someone who can read the law and write in the right language and understand the systems well enough to use them." He was looking at her with the particular attention he gave her when she was working something out. "I'm thinking," she continued, "that what I did for Rosa Medina and the cases before that, I did half by accident, out of proximity to the situation, but it could be done on purpose." "You're describing a lawyer," he said. "Women can't be admitted to the bar in New Mexico territory," she said. "Not in 1884, but there are things adjacent to that. A legal clerk, a notary. Someone who helps people understand what documents mean and what their rights are and how to write the letters that need to be written." He was quiet for a moment. "Martin would know the specifics of what's permissible," he said, "and he might want someone capable of this in the territory." She felt the idea solidify in her mind, become real and three-dimensional, a thing with shape and weight. "Would it be too much, do you think, to write to him about it?" "Write to him," Joel said. "Today." She wrote to Martin that afternoon. His response, which arrived 2 weeks later, was cautiously enthusiastic. He knew of 2 territorial statutes that permitted trained individuals to operate as document preparers and legal consultants, particularly in rural areas where access to licensed attorneys was limited. He could not guarantee admission to the bar, which required a process that in 1884 was not available to women in New Mexico, but he could describe a path that was legally sound and practically meaningful. He offered to sponsor her training and to provide her with access to his law library for the purpose. She sat with the letter for a long afternoon, and then she found Joel at the barn and she said, "Martin thinks it's possible." He looked at her with the full brightness of his smile, the one that was rare and therefore significant. "Of course it is," he said. She had not expected the tears. They surprised her entirely, coming up without warning from somewhere deep, the product of 5 years of running and fighting, and being told in 100 ways that she was trouble and a thief and a woman of no standing, and the accumulated weight of all of that pressing against the fact of this moment. This man in this barn with sunlight in his eyes telling her of course it is, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. She pressed her hand against her eyes and composed herself quickly because she was not a woman who cried easily. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," he said. "It's just a lot," she said. "All of it. It's a lot of things at once." He crossed the barn floor to her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her steadily. "Delia," he said, "you fought for 5 years by yourself and you won. You helped people who couldn't help themselves and you're going to help more of them. You walked into Millbrook with $43 and a letter you wrote yourself and you found a way through." He paused. "You are the least troublesome person I know. You are the most capable person I know. And I love you. I have been fairly certain of that for some time and I thought you should know." She stared at him. He waited. He was very good at waiting. "Joel Hunter," she said, and her voice was more unsteady than she preferred, "I have been in love with you since the afternoon you told me to stop running and the ground would hold." Something in his face opened like light coming into a room. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been carefully and deliberately certain, and had now been given permission to be certain out loud. And she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping carefully contained since May. and the barn smelled of hay and horses and clean wood, and it was the most perfect place she had ever been kissed, which was remarkable because she had not previously thought of barns as romantic locations. When they separated, she had her hands on his chest and his arms were around her, and the afternoon light came through the high barn window and everything was, for a completely suspended moment, exactly right. "I'm still going to write to Martin about the legal consulting," she said, because she needed to say something practical or she was going to cry again. He laughed, low and warm and absolutely real. "I know," he said. "Good." The autumn brought changes that she had not foreseen, and that turned out to be entirely welcome. She had sent her formal inquiry to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe along with Martin's letter of support, and by September she had received an official designation as a document preparer and legal consultant for the southeastern quarter of the territory, with permission to charge modest fees for her services and to operate independently within the defined scope of the designation. The scope was narrow. She could not argue in court. She could not formally represent clients. But she could help people understand their documents, draft letters and complaints and responses, explain what their rights were under territorial law, and refer cases to Martin when they required licensed representation. She could do, in other words, exactly what she had been doing for 5 years, but now she could do it openly in a specific place, without running. She set up a corner of the front room of the ranch house as her workspace, because Joel offered it without being asked, and because the light in that corner in the mornings was very good. She put up a small sign in Millbrook, at the general store and at the post office, stating that Delia Bancroft, legal consultant, was available in Millbrook on Thursdays and at the Hunter Ranch by appointment on other days. The first person to come see her was a widow named Clara Ortega, whose landlord was attempting to increase her rent beyond what was specified in her rental agreement. The second was a farmer named Hugh Finley who had received a notice of lien he couldn't read and was afraid he was about to lose his property. The third was a young couple named Salazar who needed help understanding the requirements for filing a homestead claim. Each case was small. Each case was solvable. Each case mattered entirely to the person it belonged to. She rode to Millbrook on Thursdays on the paint mare that Joel had told her was her horse to use whenever she needed, and the people of Millbrook treated her, after the initial careful period of assessment that small towns always applied to new people, with the particular combination of respect and warmth that a person earns by being genuinely useful. The sheriff, Cord Dawes, the same man who had warned Joel about her, stopped her on the street one October morning and said, roughly and with visible embarrassment, that he had heard she was doing good work, and he thought it was a credit to the town. She thanked him pleasantly, and did not remind him of what he had said about her in the beginning, because the most useful thing about the beginning being over was that you could afford to be generous about it. She wrote to Fenwick's victims. Martin had identified 4 other women and 2 men who had been subjected to similar manufactured debt schemes by Fenwick over the course of his career, and she contacted each of them through Martin to offer her services in building their own cases. 3 of them responded. 2 of those cases ultimately went before the territorial court, with Martin arguing and Delia's documentation forming the backbone of the evidence. Fenwick's license to operate as a land speculator was suspended by the Territorial Land Office in November, and a formal criminal investigation was opened by the United States Marshal's Office in December. She did not attend the hearing in Santa Fe. She did not need to. Her testimony, delivered in the form of those 11 pages of careful handwriting, had done its work. She followed the proceedings through Martin's letters and through the territorial newspaper, and through the conversations she had with Joel in the evenings on the porch, which was now, in November, wrapped in blankets against the high desert cold but still a place she wanted to be every evening, the mountains dark against a sky brilliant with stars. "Fenwick's going to face criminal charges," she told Joel one evening, folding the letter from Martin. "Good," he said. without elaboration. She looked at him. That's all. Good, what else is there? It's what should happen. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. Are you satisfied? She thought about it carefully. Yes, she said. Not happy exactly, not triumphant, satisfied, like finishing a long piece of work correctly. That's the right way to feel, he said. She laughed softly. You have very strong opinions about how feelings should be. I have strong opinions about honesty, he said. Feelings are honest or they're not. Triumph would be dishonest here because this isn't a triumph, it's a correction. Satisfaction is accurate. She watched him in the starlight and loved him with the comfortable depth of something that had been tested and found sound. Joel, she said, yes, marry me. He went entirely still for a moment. She had surprised him, which was not easy to do. I was going to ask you, he said. No, she said, I got there first. He turned to look at her fully. His face in the starlight was the face she had been learning for 6 months, and she knew it as well as she knew the mountains, as well as she knew the water-right statutes and the sound of the morning and the names of things she had asked him for on horseback in the early spring. Yes, he said. Obviously, yes. Yes. She laughed again, that real and unguarded laugh that she had found in herself over these months, the one she had forgotten she possessed. He reached over and pulled her close. Right there on the cold porch in November with the blankets and the stars and the cattle quiet in the pasture. And she put her head on his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and the steady rightness of the ground holding exactly as he had said it would. They married in Millbrook in December of 1884. It was a small ceremony at the town's church, conducted by the actual Reverend Palmer, not the fictional pastor of Albuquerque she had invented in her letter of character. And the irony of this was not lost on her, and she thought her father, who had had a sense of humor about ironies, would have appreciated it. Martin Shee attended and wore his impeccable suit and mustache, and gave them, as a wedding gift, a document frame in which he had placed a certified copy of the dismissal of all claims against Delia Bancroft, signed and sealed by the Territorial Court of New Mexico. She looked at it for a long time and then put it on the wall of the front room next to her workspace, because it was a record worth keeping. Emmett attended and said nothing during the ceremony, and shook Joel's hand afterward with a grip that conveyed everything he had not said across 6 years of quiet loyalty. And then he nodded at Delia with an expression that she had learned, over months, to read correctly. It meant well done. It meant approved. From Emmett it was an entire speech. Clara Ortega came. Hugh Finley came. The Salazar couple came, and the young Mrs. Salazar was now very visibly expecting their first child, which delighted Delia in a way she did not fully examine until the following February, when she confirmed quietly to herself, and then to Joel, that she was also expecting. He received the news with a stillness that was very complete and very tender, and then he said, "A baby." In July, Martin thinks. His wife is a midwife. He offered to have her come up. "A baby," Joel said again, differently, the word landing somewhere deeper the second time. She watched his face move through the news with the transparency that was one of the things she loved most about him, the way feelings registered in him as exactly what they were, not performed and not suppressed. She saw the wonder and the gratitude and the slight and very human fear of something this large, and she reached over and put her hand on his. "We're going to be all right," she said, meaning it as a statement of fact, not reassurance. She had come to believe this about them without needing to examine the belief, the way you trust the ground. "I know," he said. "I know we are." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and clear, and the kind of quiet that has substance to it. She continued her consulting work through the winter, seeing fewer clients because travel was harder, but maintaining the Thursday visits to Millbrook and the correspondence through the mail. 2 of the Fenwick cases were progressing in Santa Fe, and she stayed in contact with Martin about both. The ranch settled into the rhythms of its hard season. Joel and Emmett managing the cattle through the cold, the feed supply and the water management, and the early mornings in temperatures that had no mercy. She kept the house and the accounts and the legal correspondence and the fire going, and she had never, in 6 months of marriage, for one single day felt like a dependent. She felt like a partner in the precise sense of the word, someone with complementary capacities contributing to a shared work. She had thought sometimes about the version of her life in which Terence Mull had not come to Millbrook looking for her, in which she had not been in that saloon, in which the threat and the gun and the broken wrist had never happened, in which she had simply passed through Millbrook as she had passed through so many towns and moved on. She could not imagine it. It had the quality of a story about someone else, a Delia Bancroft who was still running, who was still carrying her records like wounds in the bottom of her bag, who had not yet stopped long enough to understand that the ground could hold. She was grateful for Terence Mull. She had never expected to be grateful to a man who put a gun to her head, but gratitude found unexpected roots sometimes. Spring came again. The desert came alive in the way she now recognized. The progression of color and sound and light that she had first encountered from the back of a horse with a man explaining the names of things. And now, she knew most of the names herself, and sometimes she was the one explaining them, to the clients who came to the ranch, to Clara Ortega's daughter who was 9 and curious, and who Delia had started teaching to read on Tuesday afternoons, to Joel himself when she encountered something new before he did. In April, Martin's wife arrived from Santa Fe. Her name was Frances Shee, and she was a compact and practical woman of 35 who had delivered more than 200 babies and had a manner that communicated complete competence without a single wasted word. Delia liked her immediately with the specific pleasure of liking someone who is very good at what they do. Frances stayed at the ranch through the last weeks of the pregnancy, which was, she said, progressing exactly as it should, which was exactly the phrase Delia wanted to hear. On the 2nd of July, 1885, Delia Bancroft Hunter had a son. He was healthy and loud and had, from the first moment, an expression of profound indignation about the world that she found completely charming. Joel held him with the carefulness of someone handling something invaluable, which was exactly accurate, and she watched them from the bed where Frances had insisted she rest, watched her husband hold their son in the early morning light coming through the window she had come to know as well as she had ever known her father's kitchen window in Missouri, and the feeling in her chest was so large and so complete that she had no category for it. She did not try to find one. Some things resisted precise language, and she had learned to let them. They named him Thomas, after her father. Thomas Hunter was not a quiet baby. He was not a baby who accepted the world's terms readily. He arrived with opinions and expressed them forcefully, and Delia, who had opinions and had expressed them forcefully for her entire life, found this deeply funny and completely right. Joel, who had more patience than anyone she had ever known, was remarkably undisturbed by the noise and the chaos and the new architecture of days that a small person imposes on the people around him. Emmett, who came to the house for supper on the Sunday after Thomas arrived, looked at the baby in the cradle by the fireplace for a long and silent moment and said, "Good," which was, from Emmett, essentially an extended ode. The summer of 1885 and the autumn that followed it were the richest months Delia could remember in her life. Thomas grew with the specificity of new things, each week bringing changes that were small individually and tremendous collectively. She maintained her consulting work, bringing Thomas to Millbrook on Thursdays in the pack her friend, Clara Ortega, had shown her how to make, because Clara Ortega had raised 6 children and had strong views about how to transport them efficiently. Joel took over certain mornings so she could work without interruption, and they had worked out, without formal negotiation, a distribution of time and work and responsibility that was based entirely on what needed doing and who was best positioned to do it. She thought sometimes about what her father would have made of all of this. The schoolteacher from Missouri who had raised her on Latin and law and the belief that the world could be made fair by careful and determined effort. She thought he would have approved. not because the outcome was comfortable, but because the path to it had been honest. She thought about the forged letter of character sometimes too, the fictional pastor of Albuquerque, the necessary lie she had told because she had no other tools and she needed to survive. She had confessed it to Joel in the 4th week, and she had not been condemned for it. Martin knew about it and had noted it with the dry precision of someone noting a minor irregularity in an otherwise sound document. She had decided to let it be what it was, a thing she had done because she had no other tools, a thing she would not do now because she had better ones, a part of the story that was true and that she was not ashamed of, because shame required you to pretend the circumstances did not exist, and the circumstances had existed, and she had existed within them as well as she could manage. This was what she told the young woman who came to see her in November of 1885, a woman of 22 named Vera Holt who had arrived in Millbrook with no money and a story of the kind Delia recognized immediately, a manufactured situation, a man who had arranged the circumstances to be maximally disabling, the familiar architecture of control dressed as misfortune. She told Vera Holt, "The situation is more solvable than it looks. The documents are flawed, and the claim is not supported by territorial statute. Here is what we are going to do." And she laid it out, clearly and specifically, in the language of someone who understood the system and had beaten it, and she watched Vera Holt's face move from desperate to cautious to something that was the beginning of hope. "I need to warn you," Delia said, because honesty was the most important thing she owned and she would not compromise it. "It is going to take months, and it is going to require courage, and there will be moments where it seems impossible. But it is not impossible. I know because I was in a version of this situation myself, and I am sitting here in front of you because I found a way through." Vera Holt looked at her steadily. How? Delia thought about the spare chair. She thought about a man who had been told she was trouble and had offered her room for that kind of trouble and had meant it without conditions. "Someone helped me," she said, "and I am going to help you, and eventually you are going to help someone else because that is how this works." Vera Holt's case was resolved by the following spring. The man who had trapped her was confronted with the legal weight of territorial statute and the precision of Delia's documentation, and he retreated, as men of his type always retreated when the power imbalance was corrected, quickly and without dignity. Vera Holt stayed in Millbrook. She took a position at the general store, and later, she married the schoolteacher who had arrived in town in the summer of 1886, a quiet and serious young man named Andrew Walsh, who reminded Delia of her father in the best way. And she went to that wedding with Thomas on her hip and Joel's hand at the small of her back, and she felt the particular happiness of having genuinely contributed to someone else's ability to have a life. Gerald Fenwick was convicted by the United States Territorial Court in the summer of 1886 on 7 counts of fraud and 2 counts of filing false official documents. He received a sentence of 3 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Delia read the account in the newspaper and set it aside and went back to the letter she was writing for a homesteader in the valley south of Millbrook, because the conviction was a fact and she had registered it, and the homesteader's letter was a more immediate use of her time. Joel, who had read the same paper, said that evening, "Fenwick." "Yes," she said. "Satisfied?" he asked. "Completely," she said. "You were right about that being the right word," he smiled. "I usually am." She laughed and threw the kitchen towel at him. The ranch grew in the years that followed. Joel bought the adjoining parcel when it came available in 1887, doubling the range and requiring the addition of a second ranch hand, a young man named Crispin Torres, who was 18 and hard-working, and had a gift for the cattle that Emmett acknowledged in his own oblique way, by simply allowing Crispin to take on increasing responsibility, without the commentary he would have applied to someone he considered less competent. In 1887, Thomas Hunter was 2 years old and entirely certain of his own importance in the universe. He had his father's eyes, and his mother's absolute refusal to accept any situation on terms she had not approved, and he was a source of consistent delight and occasional exasperation. And he loved the ranch with the complete physical love of a child who grew up in a specific landscape, knowing the names of things before he fully knew the names of the people. Delia's practice as a legal consultant had grown to the point that Martin Shee raised, in a letter in the spring of 1887, the possibility of her taking on a formal apprenticeship toward eventual admission to the bar, noting that territorial statutes were beginning to shift and that the New Mexico Territory was likely, within the coming years, to clarify the question of women's admission to the legal profession. He was not certain of the timeline, he said, but he wanted her to be positioned when the moment came, if it came. She showed the letter to Joel. He read it and set it down and said, without hesitation, "Yes, whatever it requires, yes." "It would require time," she said. "More time than I currently have available." "We'll make more time available," he said. "Talk to Martin about the structure. We'll figure it out. You'd really be all right with it." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one that meant he was about to say something very direct. "Delia, I watched you build a legal practice out of $43 and a forged letter of character. I watched you take down a land speculator who had been getting away with fraud for 15 years. I watched you help a dozen people through situations that would have defeated most trained lawyers." He paused. "The idea that you would not eventually be one is an error of omission, not a fact." She looked at him for a long time. "I love you enormously," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you back. Write to Martin." She wrote to Martin. The apprenticeship began formally in September of 1887. Conducted primarily through correspondence and through quarterly visits to Martin's office in Santa Fe, which she made with Thomas, who quickly established himself as the favorite small person of everyone in the Shee household, and particularly of Frances Shee, who declared him the most sociable child she had ever encountered, and who Thomas adored with the uncomplicated ardor of a 2-year-old, who recognizes someone genuinely delighted by his existence. The visits to Santa Fe became one of the rhythms of her life, a quarterly measurement of progress, the law becoming more solid in her understanding with each passing month, the cases she handled in Millbrook becoming more sophisticated, the consultation practice becoming something that was recognized beyond the southeastern quarter of the territory. In the winter of 1888, when Thomas was 3.5 and had just been told with great ceremony that he was going to have a brother or sister, Delia received a letter from the Territorial Women's Suffrage Organization in Santa Fe, asking if she would be willing to speak at a convention they were organizing for the following spring. They had heard of her work. They wanted to hear about it. She showed the letter to Joel at supper. He read it. He looked up. "Are you going to do it?" "I want to," she said. "I'm uncertain about the reception. You have addressed land company lawyers and territorial courts and the sheriff of Millbrook," he said. "You can address a suffrage convention." "The stakes feel different," she said honestly. "This is more personal." He looked at her across the table where Thomas was asleep in the chair. He had insisted on being moved from the children's corner of the room to the table, because he wanted to eat with the grown-ups, and had fallen asleep in the attempt. Joel looked at their son and then at her. "The stakes being higher is exactly why you should do it," he said. "You know that." She knew that. "Come with me," she said. "Of course," he said. She spoke at the convention in Santa Fe in the spring of 1889. She spoke for 40 minutes to an audience of 83 women and 14 men who had come from across the territory, and she told them the truth. She told them about Hargrove County and Redstone and Calico Flats, and about the $43 and the forged letter of character, which by now she had stopped being embarrassed by because it was simply part of the story. She told them about the spare chair. She told them about Martin Shee and the territorial court and the 11 pages of testimony. She told them about Vera Holt and Clara Ortega and the homesteader in the South Valley, and all the other cases that had followed, the people who needed someone to understand the language of the systems that controlled their lives and to speak it back on their behalf. She told them what she believed, which was that access to the law was not a privilege reserved for those with money and connection. It was a right, and the work of making it a reality required people who understood that this was a moral commitment and not merely a professional one. When she was done, the room was very quiet for a moment, and then it was not quiet at all. Joel was in the third row. He had Thomas on his lap, Thomas who was 4 years old and deeply uninterested in legal philosophy, but interested in the people around him, and in the candy that Francis she had provided, and in the general fact of being in a large room with a great many adults. When the applause started, Thomas looked up at his father and said, in the direct and informational way he had, "Is that Mama?" "That's your Mama," Joel said. Thomas looked at her on the stage, receiving the applause with the composure that she carried into everything she did. He watched for a moment with the serious assessment of a 4-year-old taking in new information about the world. "Good," he said, in exactly the voice Emmett used when he approved of something. Joel laughed, the real and unguarded laugh he had given her since the early months on the ranch. She saw him laughing from the stage, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who has learned to trust the ground, that this was exactly where everything had been heading, from the moment in a Millbrook saloon when a man broke another man's wrist to get a gun away from her head, from the moment he came out the door in the afternoon light and told her he had room for her kind of trouble. From every morning on horseback and every evening on the porch and every letter written at the corner workspace and every case that had mattered and every person who had found their way through, it had been heading here. To this room, to this man laughing with their son on his lap, to the baby that would arrive in August, to the legal practice and the apprenticeship and the mountains and the spare chair that had started everything. She stepped down from the podium and walked through the audience toward them, and Joel stood up with Thomas on his hip, and when she reached him, he put his free arm around her and said, quietly, just for her, "Well done, Delia." She leaned into him and held onto the moment, the solid warmth of him and the weight of Thomas reaching over to put a small hand on her face with the unceremonious tenderness of young children, and the sound of the convention around them full of voices and purpose, and outside the windows of the hall the spring sunshine of Santa Fe making the adobes glow amber and gold. "We should go home soon," she said. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She was ready. She would always be ready to go home, because home was not the yellow house she had sold piece by piece and dreamed about from hotel rooms and boarding houses across 3 counties. Home was not a fixed geography she carried around with her like a wound. Home was the Hunter Ranch south of Millbrook, and the spare chair that had been offered without conditions, and the man who had offered it, and the life she had built in the space of that offering. The baby arrived in August as expected, on a hot, bright morning that smelled of hay and dry grass and the particular clarity of high desert summer. Francis she was there again, and she pronounced everything exactly as it should be with the satisfaction of a craftsperson reviewing good work. This time it was a girl. She had Joel's eyes and Delia's expression of absolute certainty about her own importance, and she arrived with the force of a personality already fully formed, which Joel said he might have predicted. They named her Clara, after the widow Ortega whose case had been the first, and who came to see the baby the following week with her 6 children, and a pot of something that smelled extraordinary and a gift of the finest quilt Delia had ever seen, made from pieces of fabric that Clara identified, one by one, as belonging to dresses her children had outgrown. "For the newest one," Clara said, and put the quilt in Delia's arms with the gravity of something ceremonially bestowed. Delia held it and looked at the colors, the pieces of many lives stitched together into something functional and beautiful, and she thought that was a fairly accurate description of everything she had been given. Thomas, who was 4 years old and had firm opinions about the baby's arrival, accepted Clara's existence after a period of assessment, and declared her acceptable on the grounds that she appeared to know what she wanted and would clearly have no difficulty making this known. He was not wrong. The autumn of 1889 brought the news that the New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, which meant a constitutional process and a legal reform period, and what Martin Shee described in his letter as an extraordinary moment for the formalization of rights that had previously been granted by custom or ignored by custom, depending on who was doing the customizing. He was cautiously optimistic about the question of women's admission to the bar within the coming years, and he wanted her to be prepared. She was prepared. She had been preparing for 2 years. In the spring of 1890, on a Tuesday afternoon when the kitchen garden was newly planted, and Thomas was helping Emmett feed the cattle in the way 4-year-olds help with anything by being enthusiastic and imprecise, and Clara was asleep in the cradle that Joel had built from wood from the original barn that had needed replacing, Delia sat at her workspace in the corner of the front room and finished the last examination paper that Martin had set her in the course of the apprenticeship. She set it aside and looked at the room. The wall held the framed dismissal from the territorial court. Next to it was a drawing Thomas had made, which he said was the ranch, and which contained elements that required his explanation to identify, but which was clearly made with love and certainty. Below the drawing was a small shelf of law books that Martin had sent over the course of the apprenticeship, their spines now cracked with use. On the desk was the morning's mail, which included a letter from Vera Holt, who had written to say that she and Andrew Walsh were expecting their first child in the fall, and that she wanted Delia to know because Delia was the reason she was in a position to have a life in which this was possible. There was also a letter from Rosa Medina in Calico Flats, who maintained a correspondence with Delia that had now been going for 4 years, writing to say that the land was still hers, and the orchard she had planted in her late husband's memory had produced its first real harvest, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Delia sat in the corner of the front room on a spring afternoon in 1890 and looked at all of it, and she thought, "This is the ground holding." Outside she heard Joel's voice from the direction of the barn, and Thomas's answering shout, and the sound of Emmett saying something brief in response, and then laughter, Joel's real laugh that meant he was fully present in the moment he was in. She got up from the desk and went to the door and stepped out into the afternoon. The light was very clear, and the mountains were blue and precise against the sky, and the kitchen garden was a row of green things just beginning. Joel was coming across the yard with Thomas on his shoulders, Thomas's legs wrapped around his father's neck and Thomas's hands in Joel's hair, and Joel was bearing this with equanimity and looking in her direction. He stopped when he saw her expression. "What?" he said. "I finished the apprenticeship papers," she said, "the last ones." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he lifted Thomas down from his shoulders and set him on the ground and said, "Go find Emmett," and Thomas went because he trusted his father's instructions even when they were inconveniently timed. Joel crossed the yard to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. "Martin will review and submit, and then we wait for the territory's decision on admission." "You already know what the decision will be," he said. "I know what Martin thinks it will be," she said. "I don't want to presume." "Delia," he said, "the woman who wrote 11 pages of testimony that brought down a land fraud operation and helped Rosa Medina keep her land and built a legal practice out of $43 and a forged letter of character is going to presume." She laughed. He cupped her face in his rough and warm hands, the hands she had known for 6 years now, and he looked at her with the full directness of his regard, those winter sage eyes that had been steady from the first moment and had not wavered once. "You have built everything you said you wanted," he said. "You can stay somewhere. You can fight for people who can't fight for themselves. You have a home." A pause, "And you have me, for whatever that continues to be worth." She put her hands over his. "It is worth," she said, "everything." She meant it as a complete sentence. It was also simply true. Inside, Clara was beginning to wake in the way she had of announcing herself clearly, and Thomas could be heard from the direction of the barn asking Emmett a series of questions in rapid succession that Emmett was answering in his compressed and efficient way, one syllable at a time. The kitchen garden was beginning. The mountains held their distance. The spring light moved across the yard in the particular way it had here, the way she had been watching it move for 6 years, that she knew now as well as she had known the yellow house in Missouri better maybe, because this one she had built herself, not from money or inheritance, but from $43 and a forged letter of character, and the willingness of one man to look at the sum of her and say, "I have room for that kind of trouble." And she had found in the space of that room everything that mattered. Martin She submitted her examination papers in April of 1890. The New Mexico Territorial Review Board met in June, and in July they sent their decision, which was that Delia Hunter, formerly Bancroft, having completed a recognized apprenticeship under a licensed territorial attorney, and having demonstrated sufficient competency in territorial law, was eligible for admission to the bar pending a formal examination to be administered in Santa Fe in September. She read the letter 3 times. She was very composed about it. She went to find Joel, who was at the fence on the north pasture, and she handed him the letter without saying anything because her voice was temporarily unavailable. He read it. He looked up. "September," he said. She nodded. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. He looked at her for a long moment in the way he had, the full presence of his attention. "You are going to pass," he said, without any question whatsoever. She pressed her eyes with the back of her hand and was irritated with herself for it and not actually ashamed, because some things deserved the response of tears and this was one of them. "I know," she said. She passed. Martin She was present, wearing the best version of his impeccable suit. Joel was present, with Thomas, who was now 5, and Clara, who was 1, and who was held by Francis She with the practiced ease of someone who has loved a great many babies. Emmett was present, having ridden to Santa Fe for the first time in 11 years, because Joel had told him what the occasion was and he had said, simply, that he would be there. When the examiner announced that she had passed and that she was admitted to the bar of the New Mexico Territory, Emmett said good, in the exact tone he had been using for everything that warranted it for the 15 years he had been alive in the West, and it was the most satisfying sound in the room. Thomas, who had been told what was happening and had been paying attention in his serious and thorough way, leaned over to his father and said, "Mama is a lawyer now." "Mama is a lawyer now," Joel confirmed. Thomas considered this. "Good," he said. She heard it from across the room and laughed, and Joel caught her eye over the heads of everyone between them and smiled, the rare full smile that was worth waiting for, and she smiled back across the room with everything she was. This was the ground. This was the life. This was the spare chair filled at last. She walked through the room toward her family, and the afternoon light came through the windows of the Santa Fe examination hall and made everything gold. And she was Delia Hunter, attorney at law, wife and mother, woman who had run for 5 years and stopped and found the ground waiting, solid and real and hers. Outside, the mountains were blue on the horizon. The road home stretched south through the desert, 7 miles from Millbrook to the ranch, to the porch and the kitchen garden, and the workspace in the corner of the front room, and the evenings and the mornings, and all the ordinary extraordinary days she had been given by a man who offered a chair to a woman who had been told she was nothing but trouble. She had been trouble, yes. She had been trouble for everyone who deserved it. She had also been from the beginning exactly this. Exactly herself, exactly here, exactly home. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.